أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم والحمد لله والصلاة والسلام على رسول الله وعلى آله وصحبه من والاه. We ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to help us recognize the truth and help us follow it, and to help us recognize the falsehood and help us avoid it. We ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to make the best of our deeds, the last ones that we do, and the best of our days that we shall meet Him. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Well, inshallah, today we will start a series, inshallah, a new series about the Qur'an. So there'll be a series, inshallah, of lectures about the tafsir of certain surahs from the Qur'an. Inshallah, we'll see how far we go with that. Of course, why the Qur'an? Because the Qur'an, of course, plays an important role in the life of a Muslim. And every Muslim basically gives the Qur'an a special attention, even though sometimes it is more emotional than anything else. The Qur'an has to play a central role in the life of a Muslim. But much of the time, in a way, we take that great book and we reduce it, so to speak, into a book of blessings for the barakah. And the Qur'an is a book of blessings, but it is not meant to be only a book of blessing. It is mostly another aspect. There's another aspect of it. So the Qur'an, in a way, sometimes we look at it as this is a sacred book. It's a great book. It's a beautiful book. It's nice to hear, nice to listen to. Put it on the shelf, so to speak. And of course, or sometimes we use it to read, actually, when somebody dies. Even though the Prophet ﷺ never done that. The Prophet ﷺ, he did not read the Qur'an on people that are dead. There's only one hadith, of course, that talks about Surah Yasin. And it is believed to be actually indicating that this is something to be read when somebody is terminally ill or very sick. But even some scholars question actually the authenticity of that specific hadith. When somebody dies, the Prophet ﷺ normally would ask the Sahaba to make dua for them. And that's the best thing that can be done, is to make dua for the person that died, but not to read the Qur'an. This is not to say the Qur'an, of course, is not good, but the Qur'an is meant for the living, but not for the dead. It's a book of life, it's a book of guidance for life, and it is not a book to read on certain occasions. And subhanAllah, I know some people that even resent listening, or they don't like listening to the Qur'an because it reminds them of somebody who died. I know a family member, Sheikh Abdul Basit Abdul Samad, may Allah bless his soul, was one of the greatest reciters. But I know somebody, a family member, that, astaghfirullah, she said she hates listening to Abdul Basit Abdul Samad. Why? Because they always play him when somebody dies. And that's the problem. When the person always, uses the Qur'an when somebody dies, people will make that association. So it brings all these sad memories. And the Qur'an, like I said, is meant to be a book of guidance for the living and not actually for the people that died. It's the words of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala sent to us. That's why we have to approach it not just as a book of blessings, or a book that we read for mileage, so to speak. In other words, the more you read, the better. Of course, the more you read, the better. But it's not just the amount that counts. Abdullah ibn Mas'ud was one of the famous reciters of the Qur'an at the time of the Prophet ﷺ. And he was known for his beautiful Qur'anic recitation. And he said something really beautiful. He said, do not read it the way you recite poetry. لا تهذوه كهذا الشعر. I'm sorry, I won't be able to raise my voice. I really have a bad throat today. He said, do not read it the way you recite poetry. And keep in mind, even though he himself has such a beautiful voice, but the Qur'an should not be reduced into just listening to something beautiful and melodious, even though this is nice. I'm not dismissing that. And he said, let your concern not be the end of the surah. Do not be concerned by the end of the surah. What does that mean? In other words, once we start reading a surah, you keep on checking how much till I get to the end. In other words, just for the amount that we read. In other words, my goal is just to achieve as many as possible and get to the end. He said, don't be concerned with that, but live with these words. And that should be our approach to the Qur'an. If somebody very dear to you sent you a personal letter, very, very dear to you, sent you a personal letter, would you read it with that intention? and read the beginning and just trying to get to the end. No, you're going to spend time with each word, with each letter. You're going to read it over and over again and think about it until actually you feel that you've done justice to it. So our approach to the Quran should be like that, to stay actually with the words and to ponder about that. That's what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says in the Quran, أَفَلَا يَتَدَبَّرُونَ الْقُرْآنَ. Don't they ponder about the Quran, or are their hearts sealed or locked up? Or in another verse Allah says, أَفَلَا يَتَدَبَّرُونَ الْقُرْآنَ وَلَوْ كَانَ مِنْ عِنْدِ غَيْرِ اللَّهِ لَوَجَدُوا فِيهِ اخْتِلَافًا كَثِيرًا. That don't they ponder and think about the Quran, and if it was from somebody else, they will see a lot of difference in the Quran. It would not be the way it looks today. So that's why the idea is to live with the Quran. That's why the Sahaba alayhim ridwanullah used to take 10 verses at a time. They would read them, they would understand them, they would implement them, and they would move on. That's why they said that Abdullah ibn Umar alayhi ridwanullah took a long time, I forgot how long, like 2 years or something, to finish Surah Al-Baqarah. I mean, obviously it doesn't take that long to memorize it. You have people that are, much less established in knowledge that will do it within a very short period of time. It doesn't mean he was slow, but he was giving it justice. He was spending enough time with it as as he was supposed to do, as he was supposed to be. So the person should spend time with the Quran. Sayyid Qutb, when he was talking about the greatness of the Sahaba alayhim ridwanullah, he mentioned some factors. One of them, he said, is that their understanding and their belief was based only on the Quran. So the Prophet ﷺ, in that initial period of formation, when their belief was still being formed, when they were still learning and establishing that belief, Prophet Muhammad ﷺ was very careful that the source of all of that was only the Quran. Now, of course, only the Quran doesn't mean not the Hadith. The Hadith is a reflection of that. But what I'm saying, not the other sources from the other ideologies and philosophies and whatnot. The source was one. And that source was the Quran. Despite the fact that there were still some ideologies, philosophies, and all of that, but the foundation has to be established on the Quran. Think about that for a second. What we do today, there are so many sources of guidance, so to speak, that we base our foundation on. So you read books on philosophy, books on self-help, of course, those are everywhere. Some different kinds of book, history, politics, and all of these things. And later on, you bring the Quran into the picture. In other words, we read so much, and I'm not dismissing, by the way, these books and these writings, but they have their roles. The way we do it, unfortunately, is that we base our foundation, our belief, on all of these, and then we fit the Quran in later on, which is very different. Now, this is one scenario. That's the way we do it. In other words, the Quran is just another book, so to speak. The Quran is just another ideology that form our belief versus somebody, imagine that, compare this with somebody whose foundation is the Quran and all of the other books are fit in. There's a huge difference between that. In other words, the foundation is the Quran, and then after that, all these books and nice and cheesy culture and all of that, if they're good, that's nice, you fit it in if it goes with the Quran, but the foundation is the Quran. There's a big difference between this and that, between someone who is understanding and belief is the Quran versus someone whose understanding is all these ideologies. That person will be confused, will have big issues, will have problem submitting, will have problem accepting, versus someone whose foundation is the Quran and it's the glasses through which he sees the world, versus someone whose Quran is just one book, one idea. The Sahaba alayhim ridwanullah had that understanding. Their understanding and their belief is based on the Quran. That's how they were seeing the world. That's how they were seeing themselves. And that's how they were seeing Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So that's really one important factor. Another important factor is, by the way, just as an example, that's why the Prophet alayhi salatu wasalam, when Umar became Muslim, shortly after his Islam, so he was still in that period of formation. He found him looking for answers through the sheets of the Torah. In other words, he just became Muslim and he's looking for answers somewhere else. And the Prophet got very upset at him. And he told him that if Musa and Isa were among you, they would not be saved except by following me. See, this is a big statement in there to indicate that basically the foundation has to be the Quran. If you're looking for answers, you first look in the Quran. You don't look in the Quran last. You know, I look everywhere, and at the end, I look for the Quran for, like we say in Arabic, lil-isti'nas, so to speak. In other words, just to feel good about it or comfortable. So you'll find, for example, people quoting this or that writer and whatnot, you know. Yeah, and the Quran says something similar. It should be the other way around. It should be the exact opposite of that. Another thing, so first, again, the oneness and the purity of the source, that has to be the Quran. The second thing, when approaching the Quran itself, our attitude has to be adjusted as well. Going back to Abdullah ibn Mas'ud. Abdullah ibn Mas'ud said, when you read or when you hear Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala saying in the Quran, Ya ayyuha alladhina amanu, O you who believe, he said, listen closely. Allah is either commanding you to do something that is of benefit, or He is prohibiting you from doing something that is harmful. Listen again. So when Allah is saying, Ya ayyuha alladhina amanu, approach it with this attitude. You know, Allah is saying, Ya ayyuha alladhina amanu. I'm one of them. He's talking to me. In other words, approaching it with this attitude, that He's talking to me and He's giving me some commands. And this was the attitude of the Sahaba alayhim ridwanullah. Whenever a command comes from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, they will always take it as applying to them, not applying to the person next to me. That's why, for example, when Surah Al-Hujurat was revealed, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, Ya ayyuha alladhina amanu, the second verse, لا ترفعوا أصواتكم فوق صوت النبي ولا تجهروا له بالقول كجهر بعضكم لبعض أن تحبط أعمالكم وأنتم لا تشعرون. Allah says, O you who believe, do not raise your voice above that of the Prophet, and do not shout to him the way you shout to one another, otherwise your deeds will be wasted and you will not recognize, you will not feel it. Some of the Sahaba alayhim ridwanullah, there was one particular Sahabi who naturally has a loud voice. You know, some people have that. It's a gift. Naturally have a very loud voice. It's a really great thing to have, especially if you're a speaker. So he thought that this verse was talking to him. So he stopped coming to the masjid because he was afraid, well, if my voice is above or louder than that of the Prophet, I will lose all of my deeds. And the Prophet missed him. How come he's not coming anymore? And he asked him and he said, Ya Rasulullah, because my voice is louder than yours. And Allah is saying that my deeds will be wasted. And the Prophet said, this is not about you. They said that even when that surah came down, that Abu Bakr as-Siddiq and the Umar used to whisper to the Prophet. The Prophet did not even listen, hear them. Raise your voice, I can't hear you. Because they were afraid of their voice being above or louder than that of the Prophet. So the Sahaba had this attitude, that when approaching the Quran, they will approach it as such. You know, when we read the Quran, going back to what Sayyid Qutb said about the greatness of the Sahaba, he said, our attitude to the Quran, when we read the Quran, we read it to enjoy the beautiful language. Nice. We read it to enjoy the beautiful stories. We read it to enjoy the eloquence. We read it to enjoy the miraculous aspects of the Quran. He said, this is our attitude. The Sahaba's attitude was different. Well, when you hear, well, the language, the beauty, all of that, you will think, well, isn't that the best thing, right? I mean, is there anything better? When we read the Quran with this attitude, isn't that the best thing? He said that the attitude of the Sahaba was not that. The Sahaba were reading the Quran to know what Allah wants them to do so they can do it. There's a big difference. In other words, they were reading it to know what Allah wants of them so they can do it. Now the language and the stories and all of that, that will come. But that's not the main purpose, the main intention. The main intention is, I want to read, if these are the words of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to me, so I want to read it to know what Allah wants of me. I want to read it to understand what Allah wants me to do so I can do it. So they were approaching it not as a book of education. They were approaching it as a book of instructions. There's a big difference between the two. See, when you approach it as a book of instructions, then you will start seeing everything differently. That this was it was meant to be. It was meant to be a book of instructions, a book of guidance, not a book like a book of history, like a book of math, of biology, of whatever, just a book of education. This was not what the Quran was meant to be. The Quran was meant to be a book of instruction, of guidance. And we have to approach it as such. And when you approach it as such, you start seeing certain things that you would not otherwise. Again, back to the statement of Abdullah ibn Mas'ud, whenever you hear Allah saying, "O you who believe," then listen. Allah has given you a command. It's not just to admire the command, but to fulfill the command. That's the reason. You know, there's an example. Imagine, let's say, for example, an army commander addressing his soldiers, giving them some commands, what to do and what not to do. And you have some soldiers that are listening, and they were saying to each other's, "Oh, he's a great speaker. Listen to this. I really like the way he said this. I really like the way he speaks. I like the way he stands. Well, that's not the reason he's talking to you, for. He's talking to you to give you some commands, not to impress you. And that's the attitude that we should have when reading the Quran. We're reading the Quran because we want to know what Allah wants us to do so we can do it. It's not a book of education. Education will come, but it is a book of guidance and a book of instructions. Now, when looking at the Quran, of course, a few other things to keep in mind is, first of all, the manhaj, the curriculum by which the Quran was revealed. Now, of course, the Quran was revealed from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. But it's not just the content of the Quran that was revealed, it's also the approach of the Quran by which the Quran was revealed. There's a reason why this verse came in here, that verse came in there. The Quran, of course, came down over a period of 23 years, right? So you have 23 years of revelation. The first 13 were in Mecca, and the last 10 plus actually were in Medina. And there's a reason for the sequence of revelation. There's a reason where these were revealed in Mecca and those were revealed in Medina. Now, of course, part of the miraculous aspects of the Quran is that which was revealed in the early days of Mecca and that which was revealed in the last days of Medina, they go perfectly together in harmony. So there's no contradiction. Normally a writer changes. When somebody, no matter how great of a writer he is, when they write something, with the time they change their approach, they change their content, they mature, they learn more, they have more experience. So eventually they start gradually changing. But the Quran, of course, came from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. That's why that which came down on the last day goes perfectly well with that which came down on the first day. There's no contradiction. However, the focus is different. The emphasis is different between that which was revealed actually in the beginning and that which was revealed in the end, especially Mecca versus Medina. What is the difference? If I were to ask you, what is the major difference between the Mecca Quran and the Madani Quran, so to speak? The Mecca period and the Madani period as far as the revelation. I'm sorry? The Mecca period focused on the Tawheed. The Madani period on Shirk. The Madani period on what? The Sharia. Yeah. What else? What else actually is there a difference between? By the way, the order that you see in the Quran is not the order of revelation. So it's not like the first verse, the first surah revealed in the Quran was Al-Fatiha and the last one was An-Nas. This was not the order. This was the order that was given from Jibreel. So whenever the Prophet ﷺ would receive any revelation, Jibreel will tell him this part goes in here, that part goes in there. Sometimes there are certain surahs that were revealed complete. Sometimes some surahs revealed in pieces. But again, each time, Jibreel will tell the Prophet ﷺ, that part goes in here, that part goes in there. But normally, if you look toward the end of the Quran, generally, like An-Nas and up, mostly those will be the Mecca surahs. So, but not all, of course. Mostly the Mecca surahs And earlier, will be the Madani surahs. Like Juzu Amma, for example. All of it was Makki except for 2 surahs. Anybody knows which 2 surahs were Madani? What? Loud. Surah Al-Nasr, yes. إِذَا جَاءَ نَصْرُ اللَّهِ وَالْفَتْحِ was among the last surahs that were revealed in Medina. There's another surah. Any guess? Surah Al-Adiyat. وَالْعَادِيَاتِ ضَبْحًا فَالْمُورِيَاتِ قَدْحًا. That surah also is believed to be actually a Madani surah. So we said that there's a difference between the Makki Qur'an and the Madani Qur'an. As you said correctly, it focuses on the Tawheed. The Makki Qur'an focuses on answering the big questions. In other words, it was telling the human being, the Muslim, who he is. As a human being, who he is. What is the purpose of his existence? Who created him? Who brought him into existence? For what purpose? Is there anything afterward? What's afterward? What's after this life? What's there? Who's going to take me there? So these big questions were given in the Makki Qur'an, early days. It was answering these big questions. It was telling the human being basically who he is, his creator, who his creator is, and how he connects with that creator. Our mind, no matter how great it is, can answer some questions as a human. No matter how smart you are, I think the most you can tell is that there is a creator behind this universe. If a person is smart enough, educated enough, unbiased enough, he will come to the conclusion that there is a creator behind this universe. But that's how far you go. What does this creator want of me? Why did he create me? What is he like? How do I connect with him? All of these big questions can only be answered from him. My mind cannot answer these things. No matter how smart a person is, he cannot tell that there's a hereafter, that there's a judgment. You can come to certain basic conclusions, but these have to be given, and that's the role of the revelation. And that's what the Makki Qur'an actually does. It came to answer these big questions. And this was not an easy start. So the focus of that, where the foundation was the foundation of belief, in particular the Tawheed, the concept of La ilaha illallah with all of the ramifications of that basic belief. That there's no Lord but Allah, the only one to be worshipped, the only one to whom all allegiance belong, the loyalty is all to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And this was a difficult beginning. The reason for that, because the Arab at that time, they understood the meaning of that. That when you start preaching La ilaha illallah, means all the loyalty goes to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So Prophet Muhammad alayhi salatu wasalam basically is taking away from the leaders of Mecca all their privileges. He is stripping them off of all of their power, but because they were controlling everything. They were the ones deciding on everything. They were like practically the gods of Arabia, so to speak. So here comes Prophet Muhammad alayhi salatu wasalam, and the very first thing that he was preaching is that all of that is to be taken away from you. So in other words, all of these privileges, all of these powers are to be taken away from you. That's why they fought him so hard, by the way, because they understood what he was preaching. They understood the ramifications of his message. That when you're preaching La ilaha illallah, means that's it. Abu Jahl is like an ordinary person now. Abu Lahab is no different than anybody else. He's like Bilal bin Rabah. Umayyah bin Khalaf, the slave master of Bilal bin Rabah, is equal to him. When you say La ilaha illallah, that's what it means. That there's no innate or inborn privilege. It all goes back to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. That's why they fought him so hard. And a person may think, well, why did the Prophet or why did Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala choose La ilaha illallah, as difficult as it was, as the beginning? Why wasn't it, for example, an Arab liberation movement? When Prophet Muhammad alayhi salatu wasalam, of course, came as a prophet, the richest land of the Arabs were in the hands of the non-Arabs, non-Arabs. So for example, the southern part of Arabia, were ruled by the Persians. The northern part, northeastern, was the Persian, and then the western part were the Romans. So why didn't Prophet Muhammad ﷺ declare it as an Arab liberation movement? And if he had done that, then the leaders of Mecca who ended up fighting him, they would have sided with him, right? And he would have liberated, and then once he becomes the king, and he would liberate, then he will switch it back into being an Islamic leadership. But Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala knows that this would not work. It did not work. First of all, the land was liberated. The lands of the Arabs and even beyond that was liberated very quickly. But another thing, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala know, just to quote also Sayyid Qutb, he said that Islam is against any form of dictatorship. Whether it's Roman dictatorship, whether it's Persian dictatorship, or an Islamic dictatorship. This is not the way actually it goes. It cannot be imposed upon the people. But the people have to be choosing that. That's why when the Prophet ﷺ started with La ilaha illallah, it was a difficult path. The liberation happened within an incredibly short period of time. During the Khilafah of Umar, all of that was finished. All of that was finished, right? I mean, the Persian Empire was defeated, and the Roman Empire was defeated as well. So that's why the liberation happened. But they were liberating for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. They were not liberating it for the Arabs themselves, or for any ethnicity or nationalities. They were liberating it in the name of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Another scenario, when the Prophet ﷺ appeared in Arabia, there was a lot of social injustice and a lot of corruption. Few people controlling all the wealth of the whole region, and a lot of poor, a lot of poverty, and a lot of bad social poor, social values, social practices, oppression, persecution. So why didn't Prophet Muhammad ﷺ declare it as a moral reform movement or a social reform movement? And if he had done that, then many of the purists, so to speak, would have sided with him. They would have supported him, and they would have given him the support. And then once the Prophet ﷺ would take control, then he would change it into an Islamic movement, so to speak, or Islamic reform movement. But again, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala knew that this would not work. A moral reform has to be based on a solid foundation of belief. Otherwise, the social norms will be floating, will change, like we see happening today. Every day something changes. Is this right or is this wrong? Is this right or wrong? Let's vote. And that's it. So in other words, what is right and what is wrong is becoming basically relative and according to the whims of the desires. And the way we have it today is that religion, is ending up following the people instead of leading them. Because that's how we decide. What do you think? Should we do this? Is this halal or is this haram? Let's vote. I think it's good, I think it's bad. How about drinking alcohol? I think it's good. So let's vote for that. I think it's good. And you can carry on, and there's no end to it, by the way. God knows where this is going to lead into. Because you have certain things that are acceptable today that maybe some time ago, not long ago, were something considered to be major, sins and major thing, but now it's a commonplace. And that's how it happens. That's why a moral reform has to have a backing of aqeedah, a backing of belief. Otherwise, everything becomes floating. Everything keeps changing. People will decide based on their interest, based on their own desire, as to what is right and what is wrong. And the same thing when it comes to social reform, by the way. When you're talking about financial and all of these things, you had a lot of poor people and few rich people, but a social reform cannot be based on a hatred of one class over the other. In other words, the greed of poor people, versus the rich people, or the other way around. Now that social reform was formed after a foundation of aqidah, of belief, was established in the heart. Then the poor were content. They were not greedy anymore. And the rich started giving willingly out of their own volition, instead of being forced to do that. That's why the beginning had to be La ilaha illallah, as difficult as it was. Now once La ilaha illallah is established, once that belief is established, then everything else becomes possible. Think about it for a second. You know, Islam did not, the Sharia, as you said, the do's and don'ts, came down in Medina, not in Mecca. They came down when they were needed, not before that, hypothetically. In other words, Islam did not tell the Muslims that, well, if you're faced with this situation in the future, here's a solution. This is academic. Islam was much more practical than that. Islam gave them the solutions when the solutions were needed. So he gave them the solutions when the problem already existed, because it was meant to be implemented. And the same, if you think about it again, that in the beginning, the belief was established over 13 years. So the Muslims now, they know who Allah is. It's already in their heart. They had already submitted to Him before the commands came down. So when the commands came down, they were ready for it. That's why, and you'll be surprised, that alcohol, drinking alcohol, was prohibited with a word. I mean, now you have all kinds of problems, and there's a lot, some of them succeed, and it doesn't work that efficiently. But yet, even though, by the way, alcohol was widely spread in Arabia, it was a culture. There's a class of poetry in Arabic called al-khamriyat. What's al-khamriyat? Anybody knows? This is like a class of poetry that praises alcohol, praises wines. Oh, this, and we did this, and we drank this. And it's a technically beautiful poetry, so to speak, from the poetry perspective. You know? So it was widely spread, but yet it was stopped with a word. Allah says, جِسٌ مِّنْ عَمَلِ الشَّيْطَانِ فَاجْتَنِبُوهُ. It's from the shaitan, avoid it. That's it, they stopped. They said that when that verse came down, then people broke down the containers that had alcohol at the bottom, not at the top, because they make sure that there's nothing left. I mean, we lick it later on, you know. They broke it at the bottom, and they said that wine was flowing in the streets of Medina like rivers, which means they had a lot of it. But it was stopped with a word, because now they know where the word is coming from. Allah said, oh, no alcohol, that's it. I know who's saying no alcohol. The same thing, you know, Aisha said, may Allah have mercy on the women of the Ansar. When the verse came down about the hijab, you know, وَلْيَضْرِبْنَ بِخُمُرِهِنَّ عَلَى جُوبِهِنَّ, that let them bring their khimar over. She said that basically they cut off their clothes, and by the time of Salat al-Asr, everybody was covered. The verse came down after Dhuhr. By Asr time, everybody was covered. You know, now people struggle with that. Well, I'm not convinced. Let me think about it. Let me think, you know. But at that time, when Allah said, do this, they knew who was saying it, because the belief was already established in the heart. I'm just mentioning these two examples, by the way, but everything else, the same thing. When Allah says, change the qibla, move it. In the middle of the prayer, they move the qibla. That's it. They had already submitted to the commands of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala before the commands came down. That's why, like I said, there's a manhaj, there's a curriculum by which the revelation came down. The revelation started with the foundations. When the foundations were established, then people were ready for the Sharia. They were ready for the do's and don'ts. Before these things came down, that's why when they came down, they were implemented right away. They were implemented right away. And this should be our approach to the Qur'an, you know, again, to use it as a book of guidance and to make sure that we cover the basics. This is really what we're talking about. So inshallah, we'll start discussing, starting our next meeting, some of the surahs. We'll start to go inshallah in series. And we'll try inshallah to not to make it too academic, but as well as practical in a way that will benefit from inshallah. Walhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen. Any question or comment? Yes? Yes. It was preparing them. It was a gradual thing. And the reason for that, because, drinking in particular, by the way, has this addictive aspect. That's why it may be gradual, at least, but initially Allah says, it's a bad thing. It's not a good thing. In other words, they start seeing it now differently. Okay? So it redefined it, reframed it as something bad. And then after it says, do not approach prayer when you're drunk. Okay, I'm going to stop in there. And then after that, of course, it says that it's something that should not be done. But it's still, all of these are words. This is the thing. In other words, when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, they ask you about wine, He says, قُلْ فِيهِمْ يَسْأَلُونَكَ عَنِ الْخَمْرِ وَالْمَيْسِرِ, about wine and gambling. Allah says, قُلْ فِيهِمَا إِثْمٌ كَبِيرٌ وَمَنَافِعُ لِلنَّاسِ وَإِثْمُهُمَا أَكْبَرُ مِنْ نَفْعِهِمَا. They ask you about wine, and Allah says, and gambling, He says, there are good things about them, and there are bad things about them. But the bad far outweighs the good. What's the good? Some people, of course, they will tell you, well, if you drink a little bit, it's good for your heart or whatever, or it's good that you will make money out of it. But Allah says the danger or the bad far outweighs the good. Far outweighs the good. Now, these words by themselves were sufficient for the Muslims to change their perspective, paradigm shift. In other words, now suddenly they're seeing it differently. Before that, they were praising it in poetry and wine and all of these things. But now all of that was changed with a word. It's the same concept, that words were sufficient to change everything. It changed their perspective, and then eventually it changed their behavior. But again, the words by themselves will not work unless there's a foundation that backs these words in the heart. Yes, go ahead, Leila. Yes. Now, of course, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, the Prophet alayhi salatu wasalam, said it's haram, not just to drink it, by the way. It's haram to make, it's haram to sell, it's haram to serve, it's haram to sit on a table that has wine on it as well. Yeah, unfortunately, we take one part and forget another part. But some people, they legitimize it to themselves. In other words, well, I'm selling it to non-Muslims. Well, regardless, I mean, it's different. I mean, you have your own code, regardless. So it's haram to deal with. It's haram to work with and to sell, not just to. Well, she had a question first. You go ahead.
The Prophet said there were no cars, right?
Yes.
The bad part is clearly you're seeing that so many people die every storm, every day there's somebody died in an accident. But in those days there were no cars.
There were no cars, but. Yeah. I mean, of course, there were no cars, and of course, you can't drunk drive a camel, But even in those days, the harm is still there. Now, of course, in our days, the harm is compounded, is getting worse and worse. But even then, even if a person is living by himself, okay, I don't drive, I don't do anything, I'm going to drink, even that is harmful to you. It's harmful, of course, to your health, it's harmful to your mind, and in many other aspects. So it's multiple. And there could be maybe some additional harm 100 years from now. God knows what the environment and what the world is going to look like. But it's harmful. Yeah. I'm sorry, you had a question. Okay, anybody else had a question? But again, I mean, let's not just get caught in that specific wine. Try to see the big picture. What I'm trying to emphasize in here is our approach to the Qur'an itself, rather than just one specific thing. This is our approach. Unfortunately, sometimes, like I said, we take our guidance from everything else, and we just follow without questioning. Let's say, for example, somebody says, okay, today the trend in the clothing is the color yellow. Everybody wears yellow. The trend is floral prints. Everybody wears floral prints. The trend, everybody says, this designer says it's the wide shoulders. Everybody wears wide shoulder pad. Allah says hijab. Well, let me think about it. No, you see what I'm saying, By the way, I'm not pointing fingers to anybody or judging this is not hijabi. Allah knows what's better. I mean, everybody has, I have plenty of shortcomings. But what I'm saying, I'm just stating that example as to how sometimes we take everything without questioning, but when it comes to the guidance of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, that's when we question. Or the guidance of the Prophet alayhi salatu wasalam. Explain that to me. You know, why is it as such? Why do I have to do it that way? Yes? That's what I'm saying. That's exactly what I'm saying. That's why I said that's exactly the point. That's a good point. Is that the problem is that sometimes the foundation is not solid enough. And I think we have to pay attention to that. We have to, you know, even sometimes when we study Islam, when we study the religions, there are certain topics that appeal to us. I like to learn about some strange fiqhi matters, unusual story things, you know. What about the foundation? SubhanAllah, there's a story. Once a man came to the Prophet. I think it illustrates it so beautifully. And he says, Ya Rasulullah, جئتك تعلمني من غرائب العلم. I came to you so you can teach me about some of the unusual things about ilm. Something that appeals, that's really strange. Certain numbers, how many times is this word mentioned in the Qur'an, and all of these things, and all of these amazing linguistic things in Arabic, which I'm not saying it's bad, but there's something more important. So he said, Ya Rasulullah, I came to you to teach me about something غرائب العلم, something unusual. And the Prophet says, وَمَا صَنَعْتَ بِرَأْسِ الْعِلْمِ وَمَاذَا صَنَعْتَ بِرَأْسِ الْعِلْمِ. What have you done with the essence of knowledge? And the man says, فَمَا رَأْسُهُ. What is the essence of that knowledge? And the Prophet told him, هَلْ عَرَفْتَ الرَّبِّ. Did you learn about your Rabb, about Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala? This is the essence of knowledge. See, if you learn about Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, about His signs, about His greatness, you know, life will change for you. This is not to say that you will not be doing the other things, but you will do them totally different, more efficiently, you know, more happily, so to speak. You know. That's why the essence has to be that foundation. Yes, I'm sorry, go ahead.
How can we make our foundation elevate?
Wallah, we had a series on the names of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, right? I think the videos are still there. We can go back to them. We did a whole series actually for several weeks about the belief in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and His names and attributes and how to see that and the exercises that we would do. I think this is something that we have to always revisit. We have to always revisit to learn about Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Yes, yes. Wallahi, people have the tendency to follow the dominant culture or even curious about certain things, you know. But we have to change some of that. We have to, in other words, we don't just follow our tendencies that we feel, you know. That's why sometimes we waste so much time checking things online and whatnot because it's a dominant culture, it's the curiosity that drives what we do. We have to be aware that this is not the best approach. I mean, people change, humans change. I cannot say, for example, well, that's the way humans are. In other words, we're made to do these things. No, this is not. I mean, we have the tendency, I think, to do some of these things, but we're not helpless as far as controlling that behavior. I think we can change certain things about ourselves, at least gradually. I'm not changing that. I'm saying that suddenly we're going to become a different person. Automatically, I'm going to become a different person. No. But I'm talking about a small margin that we can control, that we can gradually change until we become better people, inshallah. Yes?
Is there a hierarchy that the Islamic teachings, let's say we said Aqidah?
Yes. Of course.
Next is Sharia.
Yes. Jazakallah khair. That's a good question. You know, not all the aspects of the deen carry the same weight. When the Prophet ﷺ said, Al-Islam bid'un wa sab'una shu'bah. Islam is 70-some components. He says, أعلاه, the highest of which is قول لا إله إلا الله. The highest of which is the belief or the statement of the oneness of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. This is tawheed. This is the highest. And he says, وأدناه, the lowest of which, إماطة الأذى عن الطريق, to remove harm from people's way. You see something harmful on the way, you know, on the freeway, something dangerous, you call 911, something in the street, you remove it. So this is the lowest. The highest versus the lowest. Now, the tawheed is more important than removing harm from people's way. Both are important. Both are part of the deen. But the top is more important than at the lower part of that. And the same thing, the Prophet ﷺ, when he sent Mu'adh bin Jabal to Yemen, he told him that you will be meeting some of the people of the book. Let the first thing that you call them to is the belief in the oneness of Allah. He said that. He says, if they responded to that, فَإِنْ أَجَابُوكَ, then you tell them that Allah mandated 5 daily prayers upon them. In other words, you start with that. If they respond to you, then you tell them about that. If they respond to that, you tell them about the zakat, about the siyam, and then so on. So there is actually a hierarchy in the importance of the deen. The whole deen is important, but not all the deen aspects of the deen are of the same level of importance. Some carry more weight than others. And as such, of course, you don't waste something less important, more important for the sake of something less important. Right? Any final question or comments? Yes. Jazakallah khair. Yeah. Unfortunately, sometimes, most of our, cultures and heritage, everybody, by the way, all cultures, many parents actually focus much on the haram and don't do this and don't do that, to the point that some of the kids get the impression that Islam is a collection of don'ts, a collection of harams. Even though, by the way, in the Sharia, when it comes to eating, haram is the exception. The rule is halal. This is very important, that anyway, the rule is everything is halal except that which is prohibited. So the exception is the haram. But also, we focus, and this is the fiqh, by the way, this is the fiqh. We focus on that, we forget, what about the spirituality? What about the belief, the intellect, the heart, the enrichment, the character? Unfortunately, we don't focus on that as much. You know why? Because this is more difficult to focus on. It is more difficult to teach a character than to teach that don't eat this because it's haram. That's straightforward. The other one is a process. When you build a character, it's a process, it's a tarbiyah process. It's going to take time, it's going to take example, it's going to take patience. It's more difficult. It's easy to say this is haram, this is halal. That's the easy part. But the part that matters is the other part, the character. Khair, inshallah. Okay, jazakumullah khair, inshallah. We'll stop in here. We'll see you next month. سبحانك اللهم بحمدك نشهد أن لا إله إلا أنت نستغفرك ونتوب إليك أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم والعصر إن الإنسان لفي خسر إلا الذين آمنوا وعملوا الصالحات وتواصوا بالحق وتواصوا بالصبر جزاكم الله خير